All right. So first of all, thanks to the museum, Bruce, all of his staff. I'm super pumped to be here. I am nervous, but also very, very excited. Couple things about my presentation. It's kind of a non-traditional artist presentation. I treated the slideshow like I do my Instagram. So I kind of made a bunch of works for the presentation. I'm going to discuss more about concept rather than my studio practice. If you want to do that, we can talk about that at Q&A. But basically, I'm not great at talking, so I'm going to read you a statement about the art, and then I'm going to show you some funny pictures and talk about the concept because I'm not that great at writing about it either. All right. So, with a long infatuation of the time span of hippie subcultures, the influences of occult practices and aesthetics, trends within the contemporary art world, I've cobbled together a practice both participatory and critical of the fluid cultural realms of which art exists. While heavily reliant on the internet for active conceptual and visual research, I've utilized social media as a sketchbook to hash out the ideas in my final plan to infiltrate what we think of as white wall contemporary gallery space. And by manipulating my understandings of the inner workings of the art world, I create projects with a humorous contempt for how we are conditioned to think about art today. With that laid out, we exist in unsure times where crippling environmental and social anxieties make the mere act of art in which we investigate meaningless concepts of abstraction seem frivolous and irresponsible. The leads of my interest in conspiracy as understanding and a coping mechanism where our brains create patterns of chaotic situations for stability and to regain control. This has been exaggerated with the internet, and now my small, seemingly harmless theories and beliefs are now widespread problematic viruses infecting everything. This is where the concept of the ironic came into play within my work, and a cynical form of coping with the pessimistic reality of the times. I was rooting for this and even participating in the hope of total annihilation, but am starting to second guess my initial plans. So that said, the work, I'm really fascinated with the resurgence of occult beliefs and interest in the metaphysical. And like I said in the statement, I think that in times of chaos, our brain latches on to different things to create patterns and attempt to find patterns to regain control. And to say that the times right now are anything but chaotic would be a dumb statement. A little bit about my history. Tim kind of told you where I was from. Springfield, Missouri, seemingly small town. Very religious family. I grew up in that. So, of course, I was interested like anything counterculture. So the 60s are kind of an iconic time that we think of as counterculture and protest, sexual revolution, drugs, all of those things that are teenage friendly for someone in a religious small town. Kind of growing up with that, I became really interested in the evolution of psychedelic culture, how it started in the 60s through the 70s, 80s, kind of where I came about to it, late 80s and 90s, where hanging out in head shops, there's kind of this aesthetic development with tie-dye, blacklight posters, band shirts, little trinkets, incense holders, various pipes and such that is kind of, later on I thought of it as this bizarre capitalistic thing that's kind of forced on that subculture itself. It's not necessarily the actual aesthetic developed by psychedelic culture in the 60s, but instead it's this 2, 3, 4 times, sometimes removed aesthetic trend that is marketed to us as a subculture, which I find very fascinating. And with all of my interest in the internet, I kind of think of where that kind of comes into play with the kids on the internet today. And it seems like a pretty easy jump, because we think of, and in the contemporary art world we think of it as well, but we're considering what looks good on a backlit screen rather than what looks good in real life, where art is bought and sold via JPEGs to never even be seen in reality, that a gallery owner will send a JPEG to a collector, it looks good on screen, that's then bought and put in storage to then be flipped on a secondary market. All that stuff's interesting to me. But to think of the 60s psychedelic imagery and aesthetic that the kids are kind of jumping on today, it seems very easy that really bright colors, type patterns, they look amazing on phones, tablets, that type of screen. So I kind of treat my work as like a method actor. So I get online and I really dive into what's going on, and I try to, mentally live the life of what's happening, and then pull pieces of that, combine it with the kind of nostalgia I have from psychedelic culture growing up, and make all of that stuff into the work. To think about altered states of consciousness, I think ritual magic is really easy to kind of combine in conceptually with all of that, because, a lot of people think of it as, counter Christian devil worship, when it's really just another investigation of consciousness, getting to an altered state of conscious through meditation or focus rather than drugs or psychedelics. This was just a fun picture I made for the next slide. So talk about ritual magic, though. There is a theoretical dark side, and I like to think of kind of where that started happening with psychedelic culture in the 60s, because we've got this peace and love, everyone's happy, we've got sexual revolution, but then there's all sorts of things kind of bubbling up on the underside and the belly of that. And I kind of think of two specific moments that kind of killed the 60s in my mind, and that's the introduction of amphetamines and violence. And violence, I think of Manson. This image here I kind of use just as an idealized version of when things started going awry. This was the Stones concert, 69, post-Woodstock, which is your ideal free love concert. Now we've got the Stones, I believe it was California. They hired the Hells Angels as security. The Angels made a lot of money on amphetamines. Crowd got wild, someone had got stabbed. It was kind of a bad scene. So that's just kind of the image I used to describe like where this kind of dark underbelly of psychedelia started to happen. At the same time, up in the top right corner, we've got Anton LaVey. That's actually a clip from a Kenneth Anger movie. But the Church of Satan's coming up in San Francisco around the same time. Just a good example of ritual magic and how this is happening within psychedelic culture. So I didn't really come across magic and the occult until I moved out of Springfield and I went to college at State Fair Community College. Studied painting under Doug Freed and Paul Allen. First time I had moved out of the home, got full internet access. Before it was, I grew up, we didn't have emails. We had dial-up that we would get on to servers that people would hold in their house. They would have role-playing games. It wasn't necessarily the internet yet. So now I'm in college, I've got a computer, got internet access. I start investigating message boards, and I just kind of go down this deep rabbit hole of magic on the internet. Chaos magic is kind of popping up at the time, and I'm not going to go into a lot of that, but it's basically the kind of postmodern version of ritual magic today, where it's not necessarily a dogmatic belief system, but it's the understanding that belief is a powerful thing in the brain, and the ability to create the belief in the mind. You don't necessarily have to actually believe in anything, but you just want that focus. So I started looking on the internet, start finding all of these things, acting kind of like I do today for my studio practice, where I'm just a fly on the wall, just taking in information, looking at imagery, looking at what people are talking about, and just an overall interest in that culture. Aleister Crowley, which is unfortunately the kind of one person we have that's the epitome of Western ritual magic. He was a charlatan, womanizer, all-around horrible person, but he's the only one that kept lots of notes. So that's what we're looking at. Sex is a very important part of contemporary Western ritual magic, and a good reason that Crowley was a big influence on the sexual revolution in the 60s. But you can even see his picture on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. But chaos magic really kind of picks up on that. And when they talk about a magic ritual, a lot of them are discussing sigil magic, which is basically a willing something that you want into reality. So that could be, I want money. So the phrase, I want money, is abstracted into a symbol, and that's meditated upon in hope that your brain will then focus on the task at hand. A lot of people in that subculture believe that kind of attaching that to base wants and needs, such as sex. And so if you're considering how a base carnal need of sex, if you're combining that with the want of what you're wanting to create in the real world, possibly that might help your brain focus on it a little bit more. So all of that, sorry I had to go through all that, but it's like a compiling of a bunch of stuff that kind of brings me to the work that I did downstairs. That work was created specifically for a show at the Bunker Center for the Arts here in Kansas City. And the show was based on a sex magic ritual performed between two gentlemen. Gentleman's a rough term, but Jack Parsons and then who you all probably know, L. Ron Hubbard. They created a ritual based on sex, loosely based on a fictional book written by the occultist Aleister Crowley. Both the ritual and the show was called Babylon Working. Babylon is the term that Crowley came up for the archetypal kind of Jungian idea of the Whore of Babylon or the Scarlet Woman. Now the sex magic ritual Babylon Working was Crowley and Parsons were attempting to bring the kind of fictional archetypal idea of the Scarlet Woman from the ether into the real world via the impregnation of a woman. So I was thinking about the artists in the studio. You know, we're sitting there making work, especially if we're abstract artists. Where does that come from? Sure, we're working with basic form, color, things like that, but the idea of abstraction, where is that? How do we manifest that from this very bizarre, strange, kind of ethereal realm into the studio and then into the work, eventually to be out into the gallery world or museum world or whatever. So that whole show, the idea was the connection of the ritual that they had produced to make this abstract thing come into life versus the artist in the studio somehow managing to make abstract work. And then I think about I make a lot of work about art. I think when we're making abstract work, we don't necessarily have a bibliography. Nobody reads artist statements, nor should you, because most of them are horrific. But the idea that an abstract artist, if you're making work about art, how are you referencing that art? So all we have are visual references. So we're almost required to make references to everything that's happened in the past in order to bring an understanding of why we're making this abstract work or how even abstract work is produced. And a lot of people, I think, are troubled with contemporary art because it is reliant on this knowledge of everything that's happened in the past and what's happening now. And I think that's a little bit problematic, and the museum, part of their responsibility is interpretation, and a lot of them are really good at that. But as abstract artists, I think we have to have visual cues to try to explain what and where we're coming from. And then this is just another really fun slide I made. But yeah, that's what's going on in the work, and we can talk about process or whatever if you want with Q&A, but thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. This was great.